I didn't hear you, but I could see you respond, Shelley. James Ferguson. Oh, I'm sorry. Judge Hunter, I had you muted. Are you here with us?
Michelle? Michelle?
Yes, Commissioner Palmer.
You're in and out. I don't even know what's going on.
Yes, so right now, Amanda Bryan, staff of the Supreme Court, is taking roll call. So all you have to do at this point is wait to hear your name and say present for the roll call. So we're just taking longer because of the technology, but we're just hearing roll call.
This is Judge Hunter. I'm here.
Enter. Co-Chair Lanier.
Present.
Co-Chair Moody.
Here.
Newsom Bass. You're unmuted now, Bree. You are here.
Sorry, yes, here.
Thank you. Dr. Dr. Palmer, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. You're in. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Steve Stevenson. Could you speak again, Commissioner Stevenson?
I'm here.
Oh, good. Okay, I didn't hear you before. Mr. Waters.
I'm here. Here, Amanda.
Thank you, Dr. Waters. Justice Witchard. Hold on one second. I'll unmute you, Justice Witchard.
I am present.
Thank you, Justice Witchard. Dr. Williams.
Present.
Thank you. We have plenty of people to constitute quorum.
Excellent. Thank you all for time. I know these are very busy times. Before we call for the approval of minutes, I just want to acknowledge a couple of realities that I think just need to be called out. I think, like so many of us, I have had 2 deaths in the family, not due to COVID, but because of COVID, unable to really go to the memorial services that we normally would have for the family. We've also had a death in the extended family, if you will, of the Division of State Historic Sites and Properties. So I just want to acknowledge the passing of Paul Laird. Some of you may have known Paul for his work with Fort Fisher. And so I just need to acknowledge that both on in terms of family and in terms of work, like so many people in the world right now, I am juggling the realities of grief. And so I just want to put that out there. I'll share a little bit more about how that's going to impact my way forward with the work that we have been doing with this commission. But I wanted to just start by acknowledging that. And with that, I also would, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to take just a very brief moment of silence for all those who have passed away during this time, particularly with COVID. If we could all just acknowledge the fact that many people are going through loss right now. Thank you. Thank you for doing that with me. And I think that's good to ground us for our work. I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes that have been distributed. I believe, Amanda, if you could confirm those minutes were distributed technologically, and then for those who needed them delivered via U.S. Postal Service, they've been delivered to all commissioners.
That's correct. They were hand delivered to folks who didn't get email.
Okay. Yes, Commissioner Palmer.
I move the approval of the minutes.
Thank you. Do we have a second for that approval? For that motion?
Second.
I believe that was Commissioner Blunt with the second, Amanda. Okay, so we will need to take a roll call vote as we do for all motions. So we will try our best to dance with the muting and muting, but let's do our first roll call vote for the approval of the minutes.
Okay, and I apologize. I know there's some background noise on my end. Be resolved in just a minute. Catherine Beischer. Catherine?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Paul Bidding. Rachel Blunk.
Yes.
Shelley Lucas Edwards. Shelley, that's a yes. Thank you. James Ferguson. Judge Hunter.
Yes.
Co-Chair Lanier.
Yes.
Co-Chair Moody.
He appears to have stepped away, so we can potentially come back if we need the vote for the minutes to pass.
Thank you. Bree Newsom Bass.
Yes.
Dr. Palmer.
Yes.
Steve Stevenson.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Waters.
Yes.
Justice Witchard. You're unmuted now.
Yes.
Okay. And Dr. Williams.
Yes.
Okay, that was the first order of business that did pass. And so our next item on the agenda is to hear a staff report from Amanda.
Okay. At our last commission meeting, you asked me to contact the Board of County Commissioners for Orange County to find out what the process would be if the Supreme Court were to request that the commissioners make a gift or a loan of the Ruffin Portrait that they own. I did speak to Sally Green on the Orange County Board of County Commissioners, and she confirmed that the process would be that the request would need to be submitted to be included on the county commissioners' agenda for one of their regular meetings, and they would take up a discussion of that issue at a meeting. So I recommend that if that is a course that this commission wants to pursue, recommending that the Supreme Court ask the Orange County Board of County Commissioners to loan or gift their portrait, I would recommend that this commission simply make that recommendation to the Supreme Court rather than reaching out directly to the Board of County Commissioners. It just doesn't make sense to have them engage in a debate and a discussion over that if we don't know if that's what the Supreme Court would even want. So I would say that if that's a part of the recommendation of this commission going forward, it should simply be a recommendation to the Supreme Court to explore that option. But that would be the process, just a request to the county commissioners that they could take up at their regular meeting.
A request from the Supreme Court, yes.
Correct. And the rest of my staff report is actually sort of a mea culpa. I realized just before our meeting that I had never sent to you all a draft of language to be used for soliciting public comment. Anticipate that your discussion today will somewhat change the way we would request that public comment anyway, but I apologize for not sending that to you prior to this meeting. I don't have any other further items to report on. I do believe that there is an agenda item to be added at an appropriate time. Commissioner Newsom-Bass would like to read an email that she distributed to the full commission some time ago. And I'm not sure, Co-Chair Lanier, when you want to do that, but I know that that is something to be added to the agenda.
Yeah, I actually think it's fine, Commissioner Newsom-Bass, if you would like to proceed with reading that letter. I think that would be fine for us to hear that now, because I think that could be useful in helping us to understand what I would call a variety of opinions that are still present in our body. And so, Commissioner Newsom-Bass, if you're comfortable reading that now, let's proceed.
Okay, thank you. Dear fellow commissioners, I appreciate the time, energy, and dedication everyone has contributed to this endeavor. Upon further reflection after our last meeting, I want to share with you that I now firmly feel all portraits on the walls of the courtroom in the North Carolina Supreme Court should be relocated for the reasons detailed below. Number one, the issue is court tradition, and the tradition is problematic because of its origins. Over the past year, the primary argument that has been made in support of Ruffin's portrait remaining in place centers on maintaining a long-standing tradition among the justices. However, that tradition itself cannot be separated from Ruffin or his legacy, since it was the commission of his life-size portrait as a venerated figure of the Confederacy in the aftermath of the Civil War that began this tradition. The maintenance of this tradition, while I appreciate its sentimental value to those who served on the Supreme Court and their families, has little to do with the people of the state of North Carolina, the furtherance of justice, or any effort to present the court as a neutral arbiter on matters that come before it. It's solely a tradition that has been established by the justices to hang portraits of themselves on the walls of the chamber. This is true of every state among the few that have chosen to commission and collect portraits of their Supreme Court justices. None of the portraits, therefore, can truly be considered neutral images because, unlike the seal of the Supreme Court with its depiction of blind justice and its inscription suum cuique tribuere, each portrait is representative of that justice's tenure, the decisions they made while on the bench, and how they or their loved ones chose to commemorate their tenure in portraiture. Number two, arguments in favor of keeping the Ruffin portrait are contradictory. On one hand, it's argued that the commission can't make judgments about any of the justices or the rulings they made during their tenures in determining whether a portrait should be on display. On the other hand, Ruffin's tenure is repeatedly cited to argue his significance as a historical figure and to justify keeping his portrait in the chamber. This only leads us back to the problematic origins of the portrait tradition. The original purpose of hanging the portraits in 1888 was to venerate three particular justices who were significant to the Confederacy, two of whom served in the Confederate Congress, and not to establish a neutral historical record of all the justices who've ever served. Number three, the original context of the Ruffin portrait is the problem. It's been frequently said at commission meetings that we must judge a man according to his times and not through the lens of the present. Again, that only makes the presence of the three original portraits more problematic because, unlike more recent portraits, they were installed specifically to venerate figures of the slavocracy in the aftermath of the Confederacy having lost the Civil War and its campaign to preserve the enslavement of Black Americans. The notion that Ruffin was simply a man of his time and that modern criticism reflects a purely 21st century sensibility is belied by the fact that a civil war had just been fought over the issue of slavery 20 years prior to the installation of the portraits. It can't be said that no one at the time would have disagreed with the placement of these portraits. It can only be said that those who disagreed had little opportunity to challenge it, especially the recently freed Black Americans who would soon see what rights they'd gained since emancipation stripped away from them under the policies of Jim Crow segregation in North Carolina. Number 4, the presence of a problematic portrait is not resolved by adding more portraits. The vast majority of the portraits on display in the chamber were not hung in the same context as the Ruffin Portrait. They were not commissioned to venerate popular figures of the Confederacy. That, however, doesn't alter the problematic context in which the initial portraits were placed in the courthouse, and no amount of new portraiture will change the historical reality of how this tradition began. Changing the size and placement of the Ruffin portrait to neutralize its prominence among the other portraits is a reasonable compromise on its face, and something that will still have to be done wherever this collection of portraits is displayed. But it's a compromise that won't resolve all of the issues regarding the portraits and only delays that resolution to a later date. There will inevitably come a time when there is not enough wall space in the courtroom to display all of the justices who've served on the court. So things can't remain as they are indefinitely. Delaying on this issue is only handing the predicament off to a later commission to decide what portraits get removed and which remain. Ruffin's portrait will undoubtedly be at the center of controversy again at that time. Point number 5, the scope of the commission includes all of the portraits. The administrative order from the court states very clearly that the purpose of this advisory commission is to consider matters related to portraits of former justices of the Supreme Court of North Carolina. There is nothing in the order stating that the scope of the commission is strictly limited to the Ruffin portrait. At our most recent meeting, it was suggested that any recommendation to remove the portraits entirely was beyond the scope of this commission. But since it is within the court's authority to remove these portraits should it so choose, there's nothing to indicate that it's outside the scope of this commission to recommend the court do just that. I understand, based on what's been shared at the meetings, that it's the desire of former justices to maintain their tradition. However, the insistence on keeping these portraits inside the courtroom, including the one of Ruffin, only removes any sense of neutrality around the portrait's presence. And finally, the court should be a neutral space. The courtroom itself is a particular and unique space that is distinct from the halls of an art or history museum. The Supreme Court should strive with every effort to maintain a position of neutrality and a commitment to the concept of blind justice. In consideration of all of this, as I stated in our last meeting, the seal of the Supreme Court is arguably the only neutral image that could occupy the space behind the justices because it is itself a depiction of the concept of justice and not a portrait commissioned to commemorate any individual justice. What should be done with the portraits when they're removed from the courtroom remains a separate matter. Based on the MOU between the Supreme Court and the North Carolina Museum of History, that may be a matter that is truly outside the scope of this commission. Removing the portraits from the courtroom and relocating them elsewhere in consultation with the North Carolina Museum of History would resolve all of these issues. Respectfully, Bree Newsom-Bass. Thank you.
Madam Chairman.
1 second, Commissioner Palmer. Thank you, Commissioner Newsom-Bass, for sharing those words with us. Commissioner Palmer, would you like to respond?
Yes. Is that Commissioner? Was that Commissioner Williams?
That was Commissioner Bree Newsom-Bass.
Ms. Bass. Let me ask you, I'm sorry. Let me ask you here. We did pass the portrait of Ruffin. Have we cleared our task with the portrait of Ruffin?
We have we have come to a place of agreement around one motion that did pass. I believe it was 2 meetings ago, that the existing portrait will come down. In terms of next steps, regarding, what are how will we share our recommendations? How will we involve the general public? And what would be our thoughts around protocol and procedure for portraiture as it relates to the Supreme Court? Those items, I think, some of them are closer than others. But what I'm hearing in Commissioner Newsom-Bass's offering today, which was also emailed out quite a while ago, really a reflection on an overarching policy around the Supreme Court and portraiture, which was included in that was a part of our a guiding directive in terms of what is our reason, what is purpose of our work. It was about Ruffin and it was about portraits, some guidance around portraits for the Supreme Court. Amanda, have I misspoken in terms of your memory of where we are?
No, I believe that's accurate.
Okay, well, may I ask Commissioner Bass? I'm anticipating and support the essence of the motion, but we'll see all that a separate item until we clear all layers of the portrait of Mr. Ruffin, so that we won't disrupt all the work that we've done to put on a new motion.
I don't think she has put forth a motion. This was. I don't want to speak for you, Commissioner Newsom-Bass, but that was not in the form of a motion, Commissioner Palmer.
Okay. The essence of it shall flow and if we can come back to her, I don't think that adds on to the Ruffin motion. I think it's a separate motion, and I hope people consider this.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Palmer. Just to let you know, you are having some connectivity issues, so we are having a little bit of a hard time hearing you, but I do think we have the general gist of where you're heading. I think what might make sense is perhaps for the benefit of discussion, we've heard that Commissioner Palmer is asking for us to kind of think about things separately. That's one reflection. Are there others who would like to respond to what Commissioner Newsom-Bass has shared so that we can hear other thoughts and reflections? I know that others have mentioned this in the past, but I'm wondering if there are those who would like to respond now. You've heard. No thoughts, no reflections on what you've heard from Commissioner Newsom-Bass?
Hold on. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Is that you, Co-Chair Moody?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, please.
What I heard was a statement full of inaccuracies. The Ruffin portrait and the two were presented in 1888. Anne Cameron presented that portrait as a tribute and in love for her father, as did the other two. Slavery was not mentioned. The Civil War was not mentioned. Absolutely, those people at that time, most of which fought in the war, served in the Congress or whatever, but that was absolutely not on their mind at the time, and she cannot prove that. To take down all of the portraits just because somebody objects to something somewhere is absolutely foolish. Every court in the nation that I know anything about have portraits of their former members, and it is a place of honor, and the families give it out of their contributions to the state, and they want to see their ancestor or whoever it might be honored in such a way. The United States Supreme Court is the same thing. And I would hate to see the response to somebody to go up there and tell them to take all the portraits and their bust down. This is just going overboard with it. There are portraits in the hallway that should be discussed if we're going to discuss portraits. There are other things there that needs to be discussed. And I think it is far, far out. Well, it's outlandish to even think about taking these portraits down. Nobody has mentioned Ruffin Portrait in 1888 until this last little brouhaha. It has remained there, and Cameron gave it as an honor and love of her father. That's taken because you can't prove anything else. So that is just going beyond anything I've ever heard. To say take all of it down just because somebody was jealous of what they wrote 150 years ago.
Thank you, Coach. Any other thoughts? Justice Witcher.
Am I unmuted? I've tried to unmute. I also totally disagree with the recommendation. I also think it is not based in fact. It is a tradition of courts all over the country, federal and state. And I think of foreign courts, I can say it's the tradition in England at least, to have portraits of former members displayed on the walls of the court. I've tried to think of a court that doesn't do this. There may be some of the newer courthouses that haven't done it, but I've been in both federal and state courtrooms all over the country. I think it's a tradition that should be preserved and extended. And I'm not willing, for example, to see my friend and colleague Henry Fry come down in order to remove Ruffin. I'm not willing to say that Sherry Beasley's portrait can never go up, so we can get rid of some of those from the past. There's good and bad in the history of any institution and of its members. And nobody ever said history was supposed to make us feel good. So I think this is a tradition of the court, and it should be maintained and preserved and continued.
Thank you, Justice Witcher. Other commissioners who would like to respond to Commissioner Newsom Bass? I see Commissioner Stevenson.
I would concur with the former justice and with Mr. Moody that, basically we are overstepping the charge that we originally had. We were to discuss and come up with recommendations for the Ruffin portrait. Nothing more, nothing less. And I understand the very passionate appeals of some that want to try to take corrective measures in what they consider to be corrective measures. But I believe we need to preserve history, preserve tradition, and stick to our mandate, and that's it.
So Commissioner Newsom Bass is asked to be able to respond. Before I do that, I just need to say one corrective, Commissioner Stevenson. We were asked to discuss and offer up some policy around all the portraits, that we do have a twofold charge. Commissioner Newsom Bass, I know you've asked to speak, and then I see your hand, Commissioner Williams.
Thank you. So first of all, my understanding is the majority of courthouses do not do this. As I recall, there was, I don't know if it was Amanda or who took on the task of looking into other courthouses that have portraiture on display, and it's only a minority of them that actually hang portraits inside of the actual courtroom. And that's my whole argument, is that the placement inside of the courtroom is what is really creating the controversy, and that they should be moved. It doesn't mean that you can't have, my argument is not that you can't display the portraits anywhere, but that their current placement is inappropriate. Number two, the argument that I'm making is not solely that the placement of the portraits is inappropriate because of the history or the context. I'm saying that you can't separate, in the case of the North Carolina Supreme Court, which is different from the histories of how portraits came to be hung in other state Supreme Court houses, you cannot separate the history of the tradition in North Carolina from its original context. But that's not the only reason. I mean, we still are dealing with one of the other things that has been raised from the beginning, which is the size of the portraits. I mean, eventually, and somebody else made this point before, and I think it's true, you're going to run out of wall space. Number three, I don't actually think it's appropriate for Justice Beasley's portrait to be raised in the Supreme Court. I mean, I think that just making portraits of the justices is a fine tradition. I don't think that they should be placed in the courthouse. And I think that clearly, as it has been stated, and I mean, Commissioner Lanier has made it clear, I can read the quote again from the charge that we were given from the beginning. We were supposed to be considering all of the portraits. The commission was obviously sparked in response to controversy around the Ruffin Portrait, but we were supposed to be discussing this whole matter in general. And I think that that brings us back to the issue of limited wall space and size, and the fact that eventually you're going to have to figure out what to do with the collection of portraits. You're not going to be able to put them all on the wall, and it's going to recenter Ruffin again. As I recall, at the very first meeting, some of the historical context, either the first or the second meeting, the historical context that we were provided with made it very clear that part of what led to the commission of this portrait was people down here having seen other portraits of figures like George Washington, which at that time was really the only portrait that was comparable in size to what was commissioned of Ruffin. And the whole purpose was that they wanted art of their dead, right? So this was about commissioning art of Confederate members in particular. This was about having art and memorabilia and things that venerated the Confederacy. I think it is intellectually dishonest to separate the historical context and to say that slavery and the Confederacy, this is in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. This is during the Reconstruction period. This is right in the lead up to the establishment of Jim Crow, which would be the law for the next century or so. I think it's intellectually dishonest to say that that was not a part of it. And that being a part of it does not mean that they didn't commission this out of love for their relatives. Those two things are not at odds with each other. Yes, we acknowledge that there is a complicated history. Yes, we acknowledge that there are things about the rulings that are made by all justices that might be controversial. That again is why I think it's most appropriate to let the courtroom be a neutral space and put these portraits somewhere else where they can be on display. People can be aware of the history of the justices. And I think I touched on everything that was said. Yeah, I mean, I can certainly like pull up exactly what was shared with us in terms of the history, but it was very clear that these portraits were commissioned specifically because they wanted something that was of comparable size to the portrait of George Washington, and that they wanted portraits of their heroes. I can pull that quote for us if necessary.
Commissioner Williams. Thank you, Commissioner Newsom-Bass.
I just wanted to add some generalities that I'm hearing in terms of the critique of Commissioner Newsom-Bass's statement. There's no such thing as neutral traditions. As long as a human being has their hand in anything, there will be biases. Some of those biases, and biases are not necessarily negative or positive. They can be a lot of different things, but the biases are there. So just because something is a tradition, it doesn't mean that it's neutral. And it also means, I mean, we've come together as a group to think through how these things connect together in terms of deciding what to do with those portraits. That to me requires a critical analysis of all the pieces that are involved here, including a critical analysis of where the tradition is coming from. I mean, who gets to decide on traditions? There is a power imbalance, certainly, in who got to decide these specific traditions. And I think that that is part of what Commissioner Newsom was addressing in terms of thinking about the fact that there is no neutrality there. We can't get that neutrality. It's never going to be there. Just as history is written by human beings once again. They go into archives, they look at materials, and then they make interpretations through their particular lenses or through lenses that they've acquired, but it's never neutral. And it's false to actually think that any of this is neutral. So that's what I wanted to say.
Commissioner Palmer, if you could just hold, please, because Commissioner Beischer has had her hand up for a moment. Okay, after Commissioner Beischer, I'm happy to. Commissioner Beischer?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think one of the strengths of this commission, and I want to say a few things. One of the strengths of this commission is the real diversity of viewpoints. And I think we've really respect people of various viewpoints. And I have learned a lot from Danny Moody, who has one viewpoint, from Bree, and who has another viewpoint. And I think that the strength with which they hold those viewpoints is very enlightening. I also think that our immediate charge, and I believe our duty to the Supreme Court, is to find a solution that we can recommend. And I think that probably not everybody, there's no one solution that everybody is going to be happy with. And that's just the reality. So my suggestion would be to adopt the proposal or motion, I forget what it was, that Judge Richard put forward some little while ago as a means of solving the most obvious present big problem, which is that there's a great big picture of Mr. Ruffin behind the desk of the Chief Justices. That's the big immediate problem. I think the longer term problem of who all is represented there, and I know from my own study of history, as do all of us, that it's not neutral. It's not been a neutral history. And one of the lessons that when I look at them, I look at it and I think, yeah, white guys all the way down, like that picture of the world. Well, there's turtles all the way down. White guys all the way back until lately. And then you see the beginnings of change. So that's part of what it shows. In any case, I don't think that we're going to be able to come up with a solution or a recommendation that makes everybody happy. But what I would like to do would be to propose that we might vote on Judge Richard's proposal to address the current issue, and that if people want to submit differing views as part of the report, I think that's great, because I think the perspectives about the non-neutrality, about the racial history, about the injustices represented by justices, I think that's all really valuable. But I would like to concentrate on what I believe is a reasonable solution to the present problem, which is to get that big picture of Judge Ruffin off of that spot, and to put a smaller picture of Judge Ruffin, bless his heart, in there with the other guys in the correct order and of a proper size. And I think that's a reasonable, if not perfect, solution. So that's what I think.
Some thoughts?
Madam Chair?
Yes, please.
That is basically what I tried to say in opening. If I recall, and correct me, in our last meeting, he had already approved most of the proposal of Judge Richard. I think the chair asked if we would go back and rethink how to close out that section of our discussion, and I believe Judge Richard has an amended section, and I hadn't heard anybody speak to it. And the amended section, I think, entails the state and the federal statute with regards to racial bias not being a part of either the North Carolina court system or the federal. The wording is very clear in his presentation. And I thought you asked if we had any changes to make to closing out that section of the proposal or the recommendation to the state Supreme Court. And I was asking if we could finish that before we get into what I know is going to be a long debate about finding another site for all the pictures in the courtroom. But could we finish on closing out the Ruffin so we won't have to keep referring to him?
Apologies, I was muted. I'll start again. So where things, I think, fell off rails a bit in the last meeting. So Commissioner Witcher put forward a motion. There were changes that were discussed in terms of the acknowledgement of the racial oppression, the history of racial oppression and its relationship to the court. That was one place where I don't think we got to complete agreement around that language. There was even, I think, a motion that went forward that with the concept that working with Commissioner Williams and some others that could continue to work on some of that language. That motion did not pass. There was also some disagreement as to whether or not with Commissioner Witcher, correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner Witcher, but I believe in your motion, it was contingent upon that smaller portrait coming up as, or a smaller portrait to be determined to be put on the wall in place of the larger one and in chronological order. There was not consensus, as I recall, as to whether a smaller portrait should go up. I think I heard Co-Chair Moody, I think at one point you said in the last meeting, if we take it down, don't bother putting another one up. I think I heard Commissioner Waters say, I'm not sure that any portrait should be up, the more that you're thinking about particularly your own personal history in law enforcement. I think I also heard in the last meeting, Commissioner Williams said, I'm not sure these portraits should be up. So even though Commissioner, we're very hard on that motion and there was a lot of fruitful discussion, we came to several points of disagreement around the nuance of that motion. We never came to.
Michelle, I can't hear a word Palmer saying.
I know. I'm dealing with the same thing, Co-Chair Moody. Commissioner Palmer, we're having a very, very hard time hearing you. And I'm wondering if you have a different line that you could call in from, because we're struggling to hear you.
I'll try calling in. Number I have, but the motion that we passed is just to move the portrait one space to the left and put up.
We're having a hard time hearing you. Commissioner Palmer, can you please call in on another line because you're breaking up?
Okay.
Thank you.
May I comment?
Yes, please.
To Commissioner Bashir's point, or Commissioner Bashir, excuse me for mispronouncing your name, to her point, since we as a commission are not really granted the authority to make this final decision, it's really the Supreme Court that has to make this decision. We are charged with making a recommendation. It doesn't seem, I mean, and this kind of goes back to a question I had raised early on, that we necessarily have to have a unanimous kind of consensus around what we are recommending. It seems like the thing that we are all in agreement on is that things should not remain as they are, right? Particularly with the Ruffin Portrait, that either it should be made smaller and moved to the side, that all the portraits should be gone, but we are in agreement that the portrait as it exists right now behind the Supreme Court Justice's seat, in the size that it is, should not be there. So I'm just wondering, is it really necessary for us to find consensus or put forward a solution beyond that? Like, could we say we agree, this should be moved, something else should be done, and then we are able to offer various recommendations about what a resolution could be?
This is what I've actually recommending for several meetings now. It's if you will recall, this is what I offered up was an example that happened at the North Carolina Historical Commission around the original response to Secretary Michelle Sanders, Secretary of the Department of Administration's request to remove the Confederate statues from Union Square at the state capitol grounds. Of course, this was pre George Floyd uprisings. And so that there was a ad hoc committee that was created. They offered up written opinions of what they thought should happen. And, there was a motion. So what is very similar to, I think, where we are is there was a motion that didn't pass unanimously, but it did pass to say, what's there should be contextualized. And then people gave their individual perspectives as to kind of the overarching, their values that they feel like need to be considered. So similarly, we may be at a place where we may need to have, a motion around the portrait, and then in terms of what happens to it, what happens next, how to receive feedback from the public, there can be a multitude of voices that I think could be heard. So I have been kind of bringing this up because I've sensed increasingly that we are not going to get to a singular voice moment. I just suspect that is still where we are. Commissioner Beischer?
Is this like a Quaker meeting in which everybody has to agree, or can we vote? And I mean, I've been in situations where I wasn't about to vote for something, but it was okay if it happened, and that that we could vote, and then people could offer other opinions. But I'd like us to get off square one and get that picture down.
Commissioner Beischer, would you like to make a motion?
I want to make sure I get this right. I'd like to move that we adopt Judge Witcher's motion and recommend that to the Supreme Court. Now, I don't know. I'm not much of a parliamentarian, so I might not have gotten that right.
Okay. I think for the benefit of all commissioners, we would need to hear that motion again. Justice Witcher, would you be in a position to restate your motion?
I have an objection to this.
Okay.
This is Judge Hunter. We've already voted on Justice Witcher's motion. We don't need to have a second vote.
Okay. Do you have an alternative motion that you feel would be help us to move forward past where we're stuck right now?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm asking Judge Hunter, Commissioner Beischer.
Yes, ma'am. I make a motion that the compromise motion supplied and voted on by Justice Witcher be supplemented by individual opinions from the commissioners and sent to the Supreme Court and published to the public for public comment, and all public comments would be gathered and given to the Supreme Court, and that this commission then adjourn sine die.
Like to amend the motion.
Okay, 1 second, please. I think there's a point of clarification from Commissioner Williams.
If we didn't pass that motion, then we should not be incorporating that component of making a smaller portrait. I'd like to propose another motion.
Well, okay. Why don't we take a minute and let's see what we did pass, so we'll get clarity on that issue. Would someone read the minutes from the meeting that we passed that motion on, and let's see what we actually passed?
1 second, Judge Hunter. Amanda, could you find that? I believe it was the meeting before last, which would be, is that June?
Yes, I have it. Let me just pull up the exact spot.
Okay, if we could all just hold tight, we're going to let Amanda read what we actually have passed so that we can move forward accurately from there.
Okay. Justice Witcher moved to adopt the proposed motion with the understanding that revisions would be made to include language addressing the funding of the replica pool and a blanket of racism in the courts past. So the motion that refers to is the document that Justice Witcher distributed to the full court. Would you like me to read that full motion, or should we just discuss what the full motion? Yeah. Okay, let me pull that up. Proposed motion for the Portraits Commission. That the Portraits Commission recommend to the Supreme Court of North Carolina the following regarding the portrait of Justice Thomas Ruffin. A rule limiting the size of future portraits of former Chief Justices and Associate Justices of the Court to that of the largest of such portraits in the Court's current collection, excepting the portrait of Chief Justice Ruffin. That the Court then commission the painting of a new portrait of Chief Justice Ruffin that conforms to the newly adopted rule relating to portrait size. Said portrait to be prepared from the Ruffin Portrait owned by the Dialectic and Philanthropic Societies, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The societies have indicated a will to the Court for a maximum period of 5 years for this purpose. The Commission recommends that the Court accept that offer. That the new portrait so commissioned replace the outside Ruffin portrait in the Justice Building courtroom, and that the extant Ruffin portrait be placed in storage with the North Carolina Museum of History or the North Carolina Museum of Art as the Court, in consultation with the appropriate officials of these state institutions, deems most appropriate or desirable. That the placement of the new Ruffin portrait be moved one space to the left when facing it of the locale of the present Ruffin portrait, and the portrait of Ruffin's successor Chief Justices be moved one space to accommodate the new Ruffin portrait, thereby retaining the current chronological sequence of the portraits. That a large replica of the seal of the Supreme Court be prepared and placed in the current locale of the Ruffin portrait, and that the Court adopt a rule that henceforth the Court's seal shall occupy said space, and no portrait of any former Chief Justice shall occupy said space to the immediate rear of the sitting Chief Justice's seat in the courtroom.
Thank you. So we've heard again, that motion did pass. We did vote on that. It had a space left for Of course, the funding conversation, as well as the history of racism and the denouncing of racism as it relates to the court. So that is where we are. Commissioner Williams, I think I saw your hand.
I'm just trying to figure out if that is the vote that Commissioner Bass reconsidered.
Yes. And so my understanding is not that we adopted that motion contingent on the revisions that Judge Richard would present at the next meeting. And then when we had the following meeting, we were not in agreement on those revisions. My understanding, and we can revisit the minutes from the last meeting to make sure that I'm not getting this incorrect, was that we were then going to work on revising those revisions so that we could come to a motion that everyone was in agreement with. In the aftermath of that conversation, I have now come to, personally, in terms of my recommendation as a resolution, I think it makes the most sense for all of the portraits to be removed. I don't think that simply commissioning a smaller portrait or, acquiring a smaller portrait on loan from Orange County is a sufficient resolution. I think it's really just kind of kicking the can down the road. That's my personal, view on the matter. But my understanding is that we did not come to resolution on that motion. We certainly were not in agreement on the motion as it existed as at the June 3rd meeting, which was the whole reason why Judge Richard was going to go back and then present revisions. And then after those revisions were read, there was not consensus on that.
Judge Hunter, one moment. Okay, Commissioner Palmer.
I'm confident that the vote will be passed on that bench where we had disagreement with the closing statement to our presentation to the Supreme Court. And I read what Mr. Richard, and he was joined to present new portrait. He said the place in portrait concluded discrimination on audience and all respects.
Commissioner Palmer, my sincere apologies for interrupting again. Unfortunately, we are continuously having issues with hearing you. I'm wondering if there would be a way to,
do you have a copy of the for portrait commission?
Yeah, so we do, and that was just, Commissioner Palmer, that was just read. So I think that
talking about page 11, where it starts with discrimination on the basis.
Okay.
That's the section we got hung up.
Yes. And yes. So if I may interrupt for a moment, we've also received, I received a message from Commissioner Blanc, who needed to type her comment because she has family matters that are preventing her from speaking right now, but she's still on board, she's listening, and she's typed this, and I'll read it. She said, there isn't a reason we can't include the Richard motion as a number one option, and a secondary option of removal, correct? Sorry, I have, she has a baby that needs tending. So I do think that we are kind of batting around, how do we want to deal with the motion that passed with contingency? That's where I think, we're getting hung up in a number of matters, but this is one place. Judge Hunter, I'm not convinced that you were finished. Is there more that you would like to say now that we've had the motion read again?
Yes. I think the commission has a wealth of views, and I think most of the views of the commissioners have been articulated. And I agree with your, the co-chairman's comments that it is unlikely that we're going to come to a majority position on any of the remaining views. We have this one point of agreement, and we can continue to debate this matter and vote on second or third alternatives, but I think it's highly unlikely that the commission is going to get enough, any of these other ideas are going to get enough votes to pass. And I enjoy a healthy debate over these issues, and I agree with much of what has been said by everyone. But I do feel that to respect everyone's time, that we should come to some conclusion about the Ruffin Portrait. Now, I can't remember who the speaker was, but I believe it was one of the professors that said the first thing we need to do is to deal with the Ruffin Portrait, and then the other stuff would follow. I feel that we have done the best we can do given the diversity of views that we have, and I think that we need to go ahead and give out that recommendation and tell the court that we would that if they wish to contextualize it further, that they can write their own agreement, because this is only a recommendation, and we suggest that they condemn racism, and we suggest that they go from here. But I don't think we need to micromanage the court. As for the idea that the Chief Justice and the other justices are going to vote themselves or accept the recommendation that portraits of their predecessors, or that their own portraits would be not hung in the courtroom, I think it highly unlikely they will adopt that proposal. But I think that we've done about what we can do, and that greater discussion on this matter is going to be a inefficient use of all the commissioners' times. And I've greatly enjoyed this discussion, because I just feel that we need to make our recommendation and conclude.
Thank you. Here's Justice Witchard. Justice Witchard is being recognized, and then I will recognize you, Commissioner Palmer.
Am I unmuted? Okay. I'm trying to find a solution here, and I'm picking up really on Catherine's and Judge Hunter's comments. Appendix B to the minutes is the revised edition of Appendix A that we had agreed to, incorporating things the commissioners had asked me to incorporate. I'm wondering if we can adopt Appendix B with the statement that if the court chooses to retain the portrait collection in the courtroom, this is our recommendation. And then if there is sentiment for simply removing the collection, let the people advocating that state it. But I tend to think, with the probable exception of Danny, there is when we were discussing it last time, there was no real opposition to this revised statement. It went off track when the idea of simply removing the entire portrait collection from the courtroom came up. So I guess I'm suggesting we adopt Appendix B with the statement that that is our recommendation if the court chooses to retain the collection in the courtroom, and then let anyone advocating the position of removing all of them state that in whatever that report would be.
There's one complexity there, Judge Witcher, that I think needs to be addressed, which is not everyone felt comfortable saying that Ruffin would be replaced with a smaller portrait. That was a point. So here's where I think we are. I think we are all at a place where we feel all. I know Co-Chair Moody was a dissenting voice here, but all except Co-Chair Moody, I think, had voted yes. The large portrait needs to come down. And then what I would say is where we are is that the Supreme Court will need to make a decision that if this is me speaking as a commissioner and not co-chair, where I am is that I think the Supreme Court needs to say if there is going to be a replacement portrait, they have to make a decision as to how to do that. We can point to some possibilities. And that there is a call for the reflection upon all portraits coming down. So I think the only place where it seems like we all, except for Co-Chair Moody, have agreement is that the large portrait needs to come down. There's a conversation about the replacement that I'm hearing from one group, and then there's a conversation I'm hearing about all coming down from another group. So that's just me kind of taking a bird's eye view, but I think Commissioner Waters, are you gesturing to be acknowledged after we acknowledge Commissioner Palmer? Commissioner Palmer?
I beg a question. The question was, did we not have agreement that the portrait would be reduced to the size of the portrait in the other collection and put one face to the left that we could stream that?
There was agreement that then the following meeting, some people rethought that upon further reflection. So I would say that if that was a vote that came up today, I'm not sure if we would get where we needed to get. Commissioner Waters? Could you start again, Commissioner Waters? We're not hearing you.
It
might be your mic. Can you unmute again? Let's try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say first, I stand in solidarity with Commissioner Bass on this because it was similar to the point that I made at the last meeting. But considering the decision that was made at the last meeting, it was mine, and just correct me if I'm wrong here, and Amanda, you may know, but I'm remembering that Justice Richards' motion was passed with dissenting votes. It wasn't a majority. It was a majority vote, but it wasn't a unanimous vote that passed it. And it was my understanding that it was going to be open up for public comment on that particular motion. That's where I thought that's where we left the last meeting. And so Amanda, can you correct me if I'm wrong? And if was public comment made on that particular motion?
No, sorry to interrupt, Amanda. My understanding is that we were asking Amanda to identify if we had the capacity to receive feedback from the public, and which she confirmed that we were, but we had not come to agreement as to what the content of that inquiry would be, or, in terms of inviting public comment. We had not come to clarity on that. Again, we do keep getting hung up on these moments of nuance, which I think Judge Hunter has a really great point. We do not have to micromanage the court. We certainly could put forward one place of agreement that, by majority vote, and then here are some other comments, thoughts, reflections that seem to have a lot of traction in certain parts of the commission. And then I think it's up to the court to determine what of that they want to put forward for public feedback. That's a little different than I think we had originally envisioned at the beginning of this journey. But I think, like Judge Hunter, particularly in light of what I shared with you all at the onset of the meeting, I am reaching a point of, capacity, overwhelm with this work. The kind of work that I'm doing, and I know a lot of you are doing, requires increasingly more and more attention way beyond the work hours, and then family as well. So I'm at a point now where I do feel that we do need to close our work as efficiently as possible.
Mr. Richards. May I amend, Mr. Richards?
You're asking to amend. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say, Commissioner Palmer. Absolutely.
Mr. Richards, would you the proposed motion for Portrait Commission, pages 9 through 11, as printed, with your last statement about the judges, Supreme Court having the authority to consider it and change it, whatever you said. I so move.
We have a motion on the floor. I believe the spirit of Commissioner Palmer's motion is to allow for the Supreme Court to offer up their own language around the history of racism as it relates to the court. Do I have a second? Okay, so I'm not sure we're moving forward with this one. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
I would like to put a motion forward that we propose, we do exactly what you said before, Michelle. We tell the Supreme Court that we had a majority vote on removing the large portrait, and then we also present some statements about what to do with it beyond that, but we at least conclude our commission with making proposition and then allowing them to move forward with that.
Okay. Would you be interested in rephrasing it as a motion?
Okay. Yes. I put forward the motion that we give the Supreme Court a statement that we, through a majority vote, we propose the removal of the large portrait, and we would also offer additional statements, but through a majority vote, that's what we proposed.
Okay, so do we have a second for this motion?
I'm sorry, I can't.
Okay, so Commissioner Palmer, you're having a hard time hearing. I think we're getting closer, but we don't appear to be there yet. Commissioner Stevenson, I see you asking to be recognized.
Yes, just for discussion on that. Judge Hunter's motion, I think, completes everything that we've looked at so far. The amendment that offered by the gentleman that we're having problems listening to, it's one that I concur with that. And then even with Ms. Williams' motion, we've got like 3 or 4 motions on it.
Yeah.
We had multiple discussions, but I think Judge Hunter's motion is appropriate. The amendment to where we leave for the Supreme Court to make the decision and discussion as to how they want to preface their statement on racism, I think is appropriate. And I would second Judge Hunter's motion. I would second as well the amendment. And I would think that Ms. Williams' motion was incorporated within that. We're getting too much into a fine line to where that original motion that we passed stated that we were going to take down the big one, we were going to replace it with the seal, and we were going to put in a smaller Ruffin Portrait. I don't think we need to get into slimming down that original motion that passed, and we present that as our recommendation to the court.
Commissioner Steve. I'm sorry, Commissioner Williams, please. Go for it.
Commissioner Newsom Bass rethought her vote. I mean, co-chair Lanier has been constantly repeating that Commissioner Newsom Bass rethought her vote. And if we took that same vote today, we might not have the same outcome. We cannot erase that.
I mean, if I may comment, I mean, I have no objection if we want to vote on it now, but I mean, that's my same takeaway. It seems like the only thing that we are really in consensus on is that the large portrait should not remain in place. And I don't know if I've not made a motion before, so I don't know how to properly do it. But I mean, it seems to me that the consensus is that the large portrait should be removed, and then we could make individual recommendations both on what the resolution could be, perhaps even a process for the court around seeking public comment. But really, from that point forward, it is for the court to decide exactly what the process is and what their actions are.
That's what I said.
Co-chair Moody. Thank you, Commissioner Newsom Bass. Co-chair Moody, you're still muted.
Am I there now?
Yes, you're here now.
Okay. If we proceed with the motion and the idea, just taking down the large portrait of Chief Justice Ruffin and doing nothing else, we have failed miserably at the charge the court gave us to do. The court said examine the portraits and recommend to the court what to do with the portraits. It did not say, I want y'all to go out here and take down Thomas Ruffin. That is not what the court's instructions to us said. It said portraits. And there seems to be an absolutely rabid attempt to destroy Thomas Ruffin. And you will never do that. He will always be the great Chief Justice. That's a point of history that cannot be erased. Now, there are other portraits that basically fall in line with everybody thinks what was Ruffin's shortfalls. And I think to ignore that is nothing in the world but trying to cover up some instances that may prove to be embarrassing to certain members of the court now, and some of the families that are still around. We are charged with the examination of the portrait, not a portrait. And we have not got to that point, and we have basically refused to consider anything but right. And we have not fulfilled our obligation. And if we proceed with this, who knows what the court will have to decide. And if that was going to be the case, they could have done that on their own. I do not agree in any instance of putting a smaller portrait of Thomas Ruffin in the courtroom or anywhere else in the building. To reduce him to that is just an insult to his legacy of jurisprudence. And to move each of those portraits in the courtroom, each time you take them down, there is damage done to those frames because they are so fragile. On the upper level of the portraits, you have to get on a ladder. It takes at least 3 people to do it. And if somebody drops one, it's gone forever. And I don't give you much to replace that. In addition to that, my understanding of the charge that the court gave us is to what to do with it. I think that includes the preservation, maintenance, care of the portrait. We have nobody mentioned that because it's been such an attempt to defame Thomas Ruffin. So I am not in agreement to just kick the can back to the court. If they wanted to do that, they would have done it already.
Yes.
I'm sorry, 1 second, Commissioner Newsom Bass. When you said no one has mentioned that we need to do, what was that last part you said that no one has mentioned? I just want to make sure I have this point of clarity.
Preservation, the restoration, and the maintenance. I think that was the way I read it was part of our charge.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Newsom Bass.
Yes. So with all due respect to the commissioners, I mean, this is an example of what I'm talking about in terms of there being these contradictions that keep coming up in the arguments that are made, in my view. So in prior meetings, the argument has been that the commission has been trying to make its scope too wide. The argument has been that we are supposed to be solely focusing on the Ruffin Portrait. We're not supposed to be discussing any of the other portraiture. Now the argument, when we have kind of like reached this general consensus that the main thing that we are solely in agreement on is that the large portrait should be removed and some other action should be taken. Now we're making the scope too narrow. I think that's a contradiction. In prior meetings, there has been discussion about the need to look at restoring the portraits and maintenance of the portraits. Now it's being said that we can't even touch the portraits because they'll fall apart if we touch them. This is kind of like what I'm talking about, and there being like these kind of contradictions in how we're speaking about it. And then additionally, this idea that arguing on the one hand that the size of the portrait of Ruffin and the placement of the portrait is inconsequential, that it has nothing to do with venerating this particular justice. But then here again, the argument is being made that we can't move his portrait, we can't make his portrait the same size as other portraits because it's diminishing his character and diminishing his standing among the other justices. That again goes back to the point that I was making, that there is nothing neutral about it, particularly if we're making this argument that his portrait cannot be the same size as all of the other justices because he deserves an outside positioning. And that's why, again, I would say, even if there's a justice that I completely agree with and celebrate their tenure on the bench, I personally do not think that their portrait should be inside the courtroom. Now, again, I recognize that the justices themselves may feel differently about that. I think that is, again, why I would make in my recommendation that they seek public input on it, because I think that I think that the courthouse belongs to the people. I think that the courthouses should be a place of neutral justice, and it should really be a matter for the people of North Carolina to give input on how that should be done. But I think, quite frankly, this is showing a lot of contradiction. You know, we went from it being the scope being too wide to now when we are identifying where we are really in agreement, the argument is that the scope is too narrow.
So first we'll hear from, we will first hear from Commissioner Witchard, and then Commissioner Beischer, and then Commissioner Stevenson, in that order. Commissioner Witchard.
Amanda, am I now unmuted? Okay. Before I comment on this, I'd just like to say, Amanda, I thought you could mute everybody. There's so much interference. I'm not hearing a lot of what's said, and I think the only way that can be controlled is by you, if it can be. All I want, large Ruffin portrait, only if it is replaced with one of normal size. I'm for keeping the integrity of the portrait collection intact and keeping it in the courtroom. That's its logical home. So there's no consensus to remove the large Ruffin portrait unless we, which seems to me an eminently reasonable solution, replace it with the smaller one. And I again think we can present that option to the court if it chooses to retain the portrait collection. I agree with Judge Hunter. I think it's very unlikely they're going to give a minute's consideration to simply removing the collection. But I think that view is here and should be expressed. But I would like to see them have the option of solving the problem of the outsized Ruffin portrait, but keeping one of regular size so that he is on the level with the other Chief Justices. But I will not vote for a motion to remove the large portrait if that's all the motion contains. Thank you.
Commissioner Beischer, and then Commissioner Stevenson.
Can you hear me? Am I on? Okay. It seems like, as my friend from Chatham County used to say, we're starting to lick the same calf twice. And I think that it's pretty obvious that people have firm opinions on different places on the spectrum, and they're unlikely to change them. And my suggestion is that we vote on Judge Wichard's motion from before and see what happens. And it doesn't have to be unanimous.
Okay, I'm sorry. Commissioner Stevenson, please go for it, and then I'd like to respond to Commissioner Beischer.
Madam Chair, what I was going to do is just call the question and ask for a vote on Justice Hunter's original motion from about 35 minutes ago that basically affirmed Judge Wichard's original passed motion with the adopted language that he put in that was then modified and leaving it up to the Supreme Court to make the decision on the racial language.
Okay.
And so I call that question, and I would ask you for a vote on Judge Hunter's motion.
Okay, and in many ways, Commissioner Stevenson, you and Commissioner Beischer, I think, are saying almost the same thing, really in the same spirit. I don't know if you all would agree. So I would like to, how do we acknowledge that? As I hear a call to question, but how do we acknowledge that? Catherine, can I see that as a motion, what you just said?
I made that motion.
Okay, I'm sorry. We have a motion, a second, and a question, so we can go ahead and vote. So this is on Judge Hunter's motion. We have a second and a call to question. We're going to go ahead and vote, roll call vote on Judge Hunter's motion, which again means that we are going to use the original Wichard motion. It will definitely mean large portrait down, small portrait up, chronological order, and it means that the Supreme Court will offer its own language on racial history. So we need a roll call vote. Hold tight, Palmer. Yes, Commissioner Palmer.
Isn't that the same? 25 to 11?
It is. We're y'all are on the same page, and so now Amanda Bryan is going to call a roll call vote. So,
and just a second, there are two other parts to my motion.
Okay.
The other parts were that along with this report, that any dissenting opinions and any public comment go directly to the Supreme Court, and that this commission adjourn sine die.
Understood. Do we have, can we get a clear second on that, please?
May I ask the question? Yeah, ask the question.
Yes, Commissioner Palmer.
Has your been completed?
Can you please repeat your question?
Because if your agenda had not been completed, we are getting ready to adjourn the commission.
Passes, if this passes, I would be okay to adjourn sine die. So,
okay.
But yes, I understand the gravity of this motion, and we did get a second. Is that right, Commissioner Stevenson? A second from Commissioner. Okay, we have 2 seconds. We need, now everyone, let's take time to have a roll call vote.
Catherine Beischer.
Unmute, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Paul Bibb. Rachel Blunt.
Yes.
Thank you. Shelley Edwards. Yes. Okay. It was hard to hear, but I see you nodding, so that's a yes for you. James Ferguson. Judge Hunter.
Yes.
Co-Chair Lanier.
Abstain.
Co-Chair Moody.
No.
Thank you. Commissioner Bass.
No.
Dr. Palmer.
Yes.
Commissioner Stevenson.
Yes.
Dr. Waters.
No.
Justice Witchard. Is that a yes? Okay, it's a yes. Dr. Williams. Could you repeat?
No.
Thank you. That was 7 yes votes. I'm gonna, to make sure I didn't miscount them, I'm gonna read back who voted yes, so you can all tell me if I'm wrong. I have yes votes from Catherine Beischer, Rachel Blunk, Shelley Edwards, Judge Hunter, Dr. Palmer, Steve Stevenson, and Justice Witchard. 7 yes votes, so that motion does not pass.
You need 8.
Votes is required to take any action.
I think that I'd like to see how a different motion would turn out in terms of our votes. I would entertain a motion to remove the portrait with the understanding that the Supreme Court can make a determination on whether or not they will replace the portrait. That is my well, I will make that motion. I am making a motion.
Matt,
Oh, you're telling me, am I going against parliamentary procedure, Justice Witcher?
Just want to say, am I unmuted? All we have is recommendatory authority. It is surpluses to say the Supreme Court can do what it wants to. I would suggest that's silly and take it out and just vote up or down on the motion to remove the portrait. Can't hear you.
I'm sorry, Justice Witcher, do you mind repeating the last part of what you said about voting up or down?
Suggesting that you remove from your motion a suggestion the Supreme Court can do what it wants to, because obviously it can. That's surplusage and frankly sort of silly in my view. All we have is recommendatory authority. So I would like to see your motion limited to an up or down on removing the large portrait without the language about the Supreme Court.
Thank you for that point of clarification, Justice Witcher. I appreciate your guidance, as you know more than any what would be appropriate or not appropriate for the Supreme Court in terms of a motion. So I'd just like to take a very simple vote about taking down the large portrait of Thomas Ruffin. A simple vote. I'm making a motion I'm just making a simple motion to remove the portrait of Thomas Ruffin, the current portrait. Do I have a second?
Madam Chair, I know we got to do point now, but could you consider the motion that we passed as printed from 9 to 11 being submitted as a report on that portrait and not adjourn signing time? Because that cuts out the possibility of other recommendations going in.
My motion is on the floor, if you don't mind, Commissioner Palmer, and I believe Commissioner Beischer, were you about to second that? I'm sorry. The first one did not pass, so I am making a new motion. And Commissioner Beischer, did you second it? Okay, the motion was, again, to take down the existing portrait of Thomas Ruffin. My motion, seconded by Commissioner Beischer. We will take a roll call vote.
Commissioner Beischer?
Yes.
Dr. Paul Bidding? Rachel Blunt? That was a yes from Rachel. Shelley Edwards? Sorry, Shelley, can you say it one more time? That was a yes. Sorry, a lot of people have become unmuted, so I'm going to mute you all and I will unmute you when I speak. So hold on just one moment. Judge Hunter. Judge Hunter.
No.
Michelle Laird.
Yes.
Danny Moody.
No. No.
Thank you, Danny. Commissioner Bass.
Yes.
Dr. Palmer.
I vote yes on the motion, but I think the court wasted a lot of money on this commission to do nothing but say take down the portrait and not tell them what to do with it or replace it or whatnot.
Thank you. Commissioner Stevenson.
No.
Dr. Waters.
Abstain.
Justice Wichard.
No.
Dr. Williams.
Yes.
Again, yes votes. I'll read them back to make recorded you all correctly. Those yeses were from Catherine Beischer, Rachel Blunk, Shelley Edwards, Michelle Lanier, Bree Newsom Bass, Dr. Palmer, and Dr. Williams. So that was 7 yes votes. That motion does not pass.
Yes. And this is where I think we'll continue to end up. I think that this is where we are. I expect that we will need to, and thankfully, Commissioner Palmer, the Supreme Court has not had to spend money on us because of one of the outcomes of COVID is the very clunkiness, the clunky realities of virtual meetings. But I think there was, one meeting where there might have been any cost to the state, but very little money, hardly any at all to speak of, was spent on this commission. So I just wanted to make sure that was known for the general public watching. Co-Chair Moody.
Yes. Can you hear me?
You can.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I can't. Okay, I'm on, right? I'm meant to do like that. Okay, all right. I would like to move that the commission send a letter to the court signed by both co-chairmen stating that we cannot reach a consensus of what to do with the paintings, and basically say we are at a standstill. We cannot decide. A majority of the commission cannot decide what to do with them, and send that and let that be it.
May I comment real quick? The thing that is, if I may say, just a little confusing to me is that, so in the vote prior to the last motion, that motion was calling for the portrait to be removed and replaced. So it was saying that the portrait should be removed, but offering a specific recommendation. The second motion was simply that we remove the portrait without putting forward a specific recommendation. So I'm wondering again, if it's possible or why it's not possible that we can't put forward a recommendation that the large portrait as it exists, again, behind the Chief Justice seat, be removed. That doesn't mean that it's not replaced. That doesn't mean that they don't borrow from Orange County. It doesn't mean anything because, again, we don't have the authority to dictate what happens beyond that. We don't even have the authority to dictate that they take the portrait down. It's really simply us determining kind of what is the output of this commission and what the recommendation is. I mean, I would be willing, if it would bear any fruit, I mean, to put forward a motion that what we give to the court is the recommendation that the large portrait, again, be taken down from its current position, because that seems to be the consensus between the last two motions that we voted on. And then we put forward as individuals, as we would like, whatever recommendations we would make from that. That could include Judge Wichard's recommendation as it's written out in terms of either commissioning another portrait, acquiring a portrait from Orange County. That can include my written recommendation and my reasoning around why I think all of the portraits should be taken out. It could also include or not include a recommendation around a public process, a process for public input. Because again, I think that the breakdown is in what is done after it's come down. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to be, with the exception of Commissioner Moody, in both of those motions, there was the recommendation that the large portrait as it currently exists in its current position would be removed. We're just not we're not in agreement on what happens from there. But I, again, don't see why we necessarily have to be. I think that there's room for us to all submit recommendations to the court.
That was going to
Judge
be
Hunter. I would like to comment. I think we just voted down the idea that we didn't come to consensus. I won't say we voted it down. We didn't come to consensus on the idea of just removing the portrait and leaving it up to the Supreme Court to figure out what we do next. I'm accurate. We did come to consensus on one proposal, and that was Justice Wichard's proposal. So I think that's the only thing we're going to be able to give to the court. And I make a motion that we just adjourn sine die and give that to the court, and that's it.
But again, we're not in agreement on in terms of recommending to the court what they do, including Judge Wichard's proposal that was written. And we don't have the authority in any case to tell the court what to do. So again, I don't my interpretation of the very last vote that we took was not that we are not recommending to the court. It's just that this is simply the only thing that we are in agreement. I mean, can anybody really dispute that? Isn't if you were to look at the last motion that was put forward and the motion immediately before that, word for word, the only sentence in there that was the same was the removal of the portrait. So it seems like the only disagreement that we have is about, it seems to me that the only disagreement that we have is what we are recommending to the court after that, which again, we don't have the authority to tell them to remove the portrait.
Well, when we started the day, we had a consensus of 8 votes around the Justice Wichard's motion from 2 meetings ago. And at the end of today, the only thing we have a consensus on, according to our procedure, is Justice Wichard's motion from 2 weeks ago. And it's unlikely, in my view, if you want to take more votes, we can take more votes. But it's unlikely, in my view, that we're going to have 8 votes for any other proposal other than that one. And I think this commission, we have to realize that at some point, further debate is not going to change a lot of minds. We need to just get what Danny had is the only thing that we had consensus of, and we can all write our letters, and add to that. But when I made that motion, that didn't get voted on. So I don't know what good it's going to do for us to use the same, to repeat our existing arguments on this subject. I'm certainly open to be persuaded on this, but I just think we ought to just say, just adjourn. Because I don't think we're going to come to an agreement.
Judge, thank you, Judge Hunter.
We've already agreed on.
Thank you, Judge Hunter. I'm going to acknowledge Justice Wichard.
Can you hear me? Okay. I just want to raise a point of order. Danny made a motion. I don't think you can deal with anything else until you've dealt with his motion. Somebody could make a substitute motion. We could defeat that motion and deal with something else. But that motion, I don't think you even got a second, but you need to deal with the motions that are made before you.
Yes, there was. Yeah, there was, and what I thought was going to be a second, Justice Wichard, was an alternate motion. Thank you for that reminder about parliamentary procedure. Co-Chair Moody, would you repeat your motion, please?
Can you hear me? Okay. My motion was that the commission issue a letter to the court signed by both co-chairmen stating that we have failed and don't see any way the wording could be arranged to come to a consensus on what to do with the portrait collections at the court. And basically tell them just that. I mean, it can be worded with flowery language and all the rest of it, but basically tell the court, due to the differing opinions on the commission, we cannot reach a consensus of what to do with them. A recommendation to the court.
Palmer. I'd like to offer a substitute motion which suggests that we send to the court what we have approved, pages 9 through 11 of Richard's motion.
Justice Wichard, can you help me with parliamentary procedure here? We have a motion and a substitute motion. Can you help with that? Do I need to call for a second for Commissioner Co-Chair Moody? Okay, first I'd like to see if there's a second for Co-Chair Moody's motion. A joint letter from Co-Chair Moody and myself saying we have failed to reach consensus and we will adjourn. That being that. Second.
And the substitute motion?
The substitute motion, which is to go back to the Wichard motion as it stood, even though we know that folks have different feelings about it today. to send that forward.
That we submit what we have approved of.
Okay, I'm here having a hard time hearing you, but I think what I hear is the motion that Commissioner Palmer has put forth is that we submit what has been approved.
I second that motion.
Okay, I hear a second from Judge Hunter. Okay, Commissioner Hunter. Okay, we have a motion and a second. I believe we need to go ahead and take a roll call vote. Co-Chair Moody, I'll be sure to. Do you have a question, Co-Chair Moody?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. You have a motion and a second. So therefore, the next item would be discussion on that motion, not skip over discussion without it directly to a vote.
Correct.
All right. Now, I can't. I didn't hear what you were saying. But,
yes, please go forward with your discussion.
All right. The motion that we just passed 6 minutes ago was a motion that failed. The motion was simply to take the Thomas Ruffin portrait down. That did not get us a consensus vote, so therefore that was a substitute for the motion that was passed before to take it down. So where we are now, the motion was to take the portrait of Thomas Ruffin down. That did not get the necessary majority of members voting for it. We're back at square one. We hadn't voted to do anything except not to take it down. So therefore, that's the reason I made my motion, because I get the necessary 8 votes to take it down.
Co-Chair Moody, there still is a vote that did pass under Witchard. So I think that's what Commissioner Palmer is referring to. Commissioner Witchard, I see you raising your hand.
Again, I'm on procedure now. Can you hear me? Okay. I think Dr. Palmer's motion is different from what we defeated or what we failed to pass. I think what we failed to pass was what is Appendix B to the minutes of the last meeting. I had a very difficult time hearing Dr. Palmer, but if I understand his motion, it's to approve Appendix A, which we had earlier approved. So I don't think there is a parliamentary impediment to voting on that.
Yeah, it's Appendix A that I'm suggesting we submit that we accomplished.
And what I would accomplish is at least making a recommendation on the major issues the court presented to us.
So we have a motion from Palmer. We have a second from Stevenson, if my memory serves me correctly. I'm sorry, was that Judge Hunter who seconded? And then we have discussion. Okay, thank you, Commissioner Stevenson.
I would like to leave it like yes for this.
Dr. Palmer, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Stevenson, for letting us know. And we've had discussion from Co-Chair Moody and Justice Witchard, so I think we need a roll call vote.
And I apologize, but Co-Chair Lanier, could you just restate what exactly this vote is for my records? I'll unmute you.
Yes, and if you could unmute Justice Witchard, I just want to have a little help in clarifying for everyone, including the public. So what I have heard Commissioner Palmer say is that he is asking, his motion was to send forward to the Supreme Court the language that was included in Appendix A. Is that correct, Commissioner Witcher?
That's my understanding.
Yes.
Yes.
And yes, the language of Appendix A. Commissioner Newsom Bass has put in the chat that let's not forget the Appendix A was its approval was contingent upon approval of Appendix B. And so can we also ask, in the spirit of what Danny was saying in terms of discussion, Commissioner Palmer, are you saying that we're sending forward Appendix A with the understanding that we would ask the Supreme Court to clarify the language of Appendix B?
If that's what you want, it's only moving Appendix A.
Okay, so that's still. Yeah, I think this is a little muddy, but I think if Appendix A is approval, if Appendix A's approval was contingent on the approval of Appendix B, and that's how the vote went. Justice Witcher, do you have any thoughts on parliamentary procedure for that? I don't know if we can.
Well, there are definitely differences between Appendix B and Appendix A, and therefore, I mean, you could argue this is included, but there were differences. So I think from a parliamentary standpoint, the voting down of Appendix B does not automatically vote down Appendix A.
Take a roll call vote on Appendix A going forward to the Supreme Court.
Could I have a question?
Yes, Commissioner Beischer, you had a question before we start?
Help me remember what's in Appendix A and B? In quick summary.
Yeah, so Appendix A is the motion that was put forward by Justice Witcher at our June 3rd meeting. It was the one that I read aloud earlier today. And then Appendix B is the revisions to that motion that Justice Witcher presented at our July 23rd meeting that included a statement, a blanket statement condemning racism, and also information about possible funding for a replacement portrait.
So I'd like to find out from Justice Witcher, what's your perspective on this at the moment?
Well, again,
since it's your motion.
It's Dr. Palmer's motion to adopt language that I proposed some time ago. But again, my parliamentary answer is there definitely are differences between these two motions, and therefore this one is not prohibited. If you want to know my intent, I will vote for this as something that if the commission can come to, we have given the Supreme Court a reasonable solution to the problem that led it to appoint this commission in the first place, and we'll have accomplished something. Whereas without this, we could end up having accomplished nothing. We haven't cost the court money, as Danny suggested, but we haven't really provided the service to the court that it asked us to provide. So I intend to vote for this.
Thank you.
Okay, I will start the roll call vote. All right, Catherine Beischer.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Paul Bidding. Rachel Blank. Rachel?
Yes.
Shelley Lucas Edwards. James Ferguson. Judge Hunter.
Yes.
Thank you. Michelle Lanier.
Yes.
Thank you. Danny Moody.
No. And let me correct Justice Switchard. I did not suggest that this commission or the court spend any money on this commission. I hadn't mentioned money. That was somebody else.
I believe it was Dr. Palmer earlier who mentioned that.
That is correct.
You do need.
That's correct.
Bree Newsom Bass.
No.
Thank you. Dr. Palmer.
Yes.
Steve Stevenson. That's at the moment.
He offered up a yes beforehand. Before he said he had a personal commitment and said that his vote would be yes.
Okay, thank you. And I do recall him saying that. Dr. Waters. Dr. Waters.
No.
Justice Switchard.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Williams.
No.
Thank you. We have notes. Let me read them back to make sure I've recorded you all correctly. Catherine Beischer, Rachel Blunk, Shelley Lucas Edwards, Hunter, Co-Chair Michelle Lanier, Dr. Palmer, Steve Stevenson, Justice Switchard. Those all yes votes. There's 8 votes, so that motion does carry. So that was submission of Appendix A, Justice Switchard's original recommendation to the Supreme Court.
I would like to just clarify the reason I voted yes on that is I do think that should go forward, as I think all information from our deliberation needs to go forward to the Supreme Court in the minutes. I know that wasn't the motion, but I do think that they're going to need to see the record of our work. And I also am wanting for all of us that have additional thoughts, as I do have additional thoughts, to submit our own letters to Amanda. And I don't think that takes a motion for somebody to submit some thoughts to Amanda for the record. Justice Switchard.
I agree with you that this is like when the court has a divided vote, there are dissenting opinions. I think with a commission, it's what you would call a minority report or reports. But certainly Danny, Bree, Darren, and Latrice should express their views, and they may get together and conferring what one of them writes, or they may want to each write separately. But this is the report of a majority of the commission, and presumably there will be one or more minority reports.
Not to prolong the conversation, Madam Chair, but I think Appendix B ought to also be included information in that report.
They will receive the full, because of the laws of that, even general statutes that oversee our work as a commission. They will need to have the public record. There will need to be a compendium of all of our work. Commissioner Newsom has asked to be acknowledged.
Yes, thank you. You've kind of already answered my question, because when I typed in the chat putting forward a motion, what I was going to put forward is that we submit several recommendations, but if it's not necessary for us to vote on it, then I think that's fine, because again, I certainly don't interpret the charge that we got from the Supreme Court as us making the decision for them, even necessarily reaching a majority opinion, though we have reached a majority, opinion on a recommendation. So I think just putting forward our multiple recommendations is a way to go. And the last thing I would say is, I honestly don't think that everybody should walk away from this process thinking that it was a waste of time, or that nothing came from it, or that we didn't offer anything up in terms of what the court asked us to do. I think we've engaged in a robust discussion. We have looked at the historical records. We have examined similar situations in other courts. The fact that we didn't reach, a unanimous decision is reflective of many things. I mean, I think that's reflective in a lot of ways of the reality. And I'm sure that when it's handed over to the court, they are going to have to also engage in a lot of discussions similar to what we did. So again, like I said, I genuinely mean it when I say I respect the input and the expertise and the opinions and the time of everyone on the commission. And I look forward to submitting my dissenting opinion.
Madam Chairman, you brought up the issue of opportunity. Let me say that I leave this meeting now feeling like the commission has well spent the court's money in saying that here are some agreements that we did reach and that we are sending it to the opinion. So may I move, sign it, die?
I'm sorry, Amanda and I are playing with the unmute button. So sine die, for those of you who don't know, means that we will adjourn completely. We will close out our work. Before I entertain that motion, I would like to acknowledge Commissioner Beischer. I would like to offer an opportunity for my co-chair to say a few remarks, and I'd like to say a few remarks briefly. Commissioner Beischer.
I just want to thank you, Michelle, and your tact and your patience, and especially all those things in a difficult time for you. You've done a fabulous job.
Thank you, Commissioner Beischer. I appreciate your feedback. Co-Chair Moody, would you like to share any closing thoughts? I'd like to share some as well after you.
Well, the only thing I would say this time, am I on or off? I'm on. Is that this commission was given a opportunity to do something good. I think it was spelled out very clearly in the orders that we got from the court, examinations of portraits, what to do with them, the portrait collection as a whole. Because of I would say warped minds, everybody concentrated on Thomas Ruffin. They looked at a small segment of his life, and all of a sudden, he was a great devil. Anytime you examine anybody's life, you look at the entirety of their life, not one small segment. And I'm sure if somebody looked at the backgrounds of some of the people on this commission, there are things there that you don't want on the front page of the paper. So I think the commission has failed in its duty. I think that basically this will be well received by the court, knowing the personnel there. And I will not agree to remove any painting or any monument of any historical importance from anywhere. All history must be preserved. And I think it's rather distasteful in my mind for a few people to decide to take monuments or portraits down just to appease somebody else. So I'm glad we're over with, and this is one thing I won't have to worry about anymore.
Thank you for your candor, Co-Chair Moody. I would just like to wish each of you well. These are times that many of us have never seen before, but they're not unprecedented, in that history does teach us that our ancestors of all backgrounds, all ethnicities, have survived wars and pandemics and uprisings and threats to justice. And one of the things that I have truly relished about our time together is the variety of perspectives, the walks of life, the values, the fact that we've had a chance to come together, even in disagreement, I think is an extension of the democracy that I think that we all value. I will not forget this time with you. I have learned a lot. And I think that we do need to keep saying the name Thomas Ruffin. We need to say every little thing about him that we can share, because there is much of this man's legacy that still lives with us. And I think that it's a legacy that, for me, is one that I will continue to resist. And I thank you. I will entertain the motion for adjournment. Commissioner Palmer? Would you repeat, please?
I had moved to sign it down.
Do I have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second to adjourn sine die. Our last roll call vote.
Catherine Beischer. I believe she's no longer on the call. Dr. Paul Bidding. Rachel Black. Yes. Thank you. Shelley Edwards. Yes. James Ferguson. Judge Hunter. Oh, hold on one second. Judge Hunter.
Yes.
Thank you. Co-Chair Lanier.
Yes.
Thank you. Co-Chair Moody is no longer on the call. Commissioner Brenus and Bass.
And thank you, Michelle, for your leadership, and thank you, Amanda, for your support, your staff support.
Happy to provide. And that was a yes vote from you, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Palmer?
You and the commission done a good job. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Commissioner Stevenson? He is no longer on the call, I believe. Dr. Waters?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Justice Witcher?
Yes.
Thank you, Justice Witcher. And Dr. Williams.
Michelle, I deeply appreciate everything you've done. Amanda, thank you so much. I appreciate your support. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. We have a majority vote to adjourn.
With that, we are adjourned. Thank you, Amanda. Please give our gratitude to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Sherry Beasley. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.